download our Revise It Right revision app for hundreds of videos, quizzes, exam questions, tutor support and so much more. In this video we are going to be looking at stem cells. Now, stem cells are undifferentiated cells, and you remember from the last video that means they are unspecialized. Now this means they do not have a particular function. Okay, you'll remember a specialized cell is a cell that has a particular function, and we looked at examples of those. But an undifferentiated, unspecialized cell does not have a function, and we call them stem cells. Now we need to remember that there are two types of stem cell. We've got the embryonic stem cell and we've got the adult stem cell. Now embryonic stem cells, as the name suggests, they actually come from an embryo. Okay, so they come from an embryo, a developing embryo. Now, these are really, really useful as they can differentiate into any types of cell. You'll remember, hopefully from last video, that when we talk about differentiate, we're talking about the process where an unspecialized cell turns into a specialized cell. So, for example, a unspecialized cell, which would be a stem cell, turning into a nerve cell. For example, that's what we mean by differentiate. So an embryonic stem cell can differentiate into any type of cell that we've looked at, any type of cell. Whereas an adult stem cell can only differentiate into certain types of cell. Okay, so you need to be aware that you can get adult stem cells from our bone marrow. Okay, now these stem cells that you find in our bone marrow can only differentiate into certain types of cell. They can only differentiate into blood cells. Now we've not looked at any blood cells yet, but you've got white and red blood cells. So the cells in our bone marrow can only differentiate into blood cells. So embryonic stem cells are obviously much more useful potentially, but adult stem cells are also useful. Okay, now when I talk about them being useful, what I'm actually talking about is them being used in medicine for repairing damaged cells. Okay, so we're actually using stem cells to treat different things, such as paralysis, which is when the individual is paralyzed, or diabetes. So these are two things that stem cells have actually been able to treat in medicine. So they're obviously very useful. Embryonic stem cells potentially more useful because they can differentiate into any type of cell. So for example, a nerve cell and paralysis. Whereas the adult stem cells can only differentiate into certain types. Now you need to be aware, first of all you need to remember that we've been used these to treat paralysis and diabetes, but you also need to be aware. Remember to download our Revise It Right revision app, watch over 700 videos, answer 4,000 plus quiz questions, over 1,000 flashcards, 1,000 exam questions, worksheets, forums, and get help from qualified teachers and so much more. The link is in the description. Of some advantages and some disadvantages of using embryonic stem cells in medicine. Okay, because there is a big debate about whether they should be used in medicine or not. So you have to be aware of this debate because you may get given something we call an evaluate question. Now, an evaluate question is usually a 6-mark question that asks you to talk about the pros and cons and then write a conclusion. And we'll do that in a future video on this topic when we look at answering exam questions. But for now, let's just learn the advantages and the disadvantages. So in terms of embryonic stem cells in medicine, an advantage is that we can create many embryos in a lab. Okay, there's a painless technique and we can create many of them. And this also here, this next one is really the biggest advantage, that we can use it to treat many diseases. So I've already talked about the fact that we can use it to treat paralysis and diabetes. hopefully in the future, really the idea is that these can be used to treat many more different types of disease. So that's a massive advantage. And comparing them to an adult stem cell, they can become any type of cell. Whereas, remember, the ones in the bone marrow can only treat a certain amount of diseases and can only differentiate into a certain type of cell. So they're the advantages of using embryonic stem cells in medicine. However, the disadvantages are it's causing harm or even death to the embryo. And this is a huge disadvantage in that, really, you are potentially taking away the life of an embryo. Okay, now you can have your opinions on whether you think that an embryo, and when we talk about an embryo, we're talking about a developing human prior to 8 weeks. So before the 8-week point in pregnancy, that's when we class it as an embryo, just a ball of cells. Now, you can have a debate as whether you think that's living or not, but what you are definitely doing, if you are going to kill the embryo, is you are taking away its life. You are taking away its potential life. That's a disadvantage. The embryo cannot consent. Now, obviously, because the embryo cannot talk yet, it cannot consent, but this is a big disadvantage. You know, if we were to do anything to any of you guys watching, and we were asking you for a transplant, we wanted one of your kidneys, for example, you would have to consent for that. That's a legal thing. You'd have to consent. Whereas embryos, they can't consent to this. So that's a disadvantage. And also the fact it's an unreliable technique and it may not work. Although much research has been done on stem cells, really scientists are still not at the point yet where they would have liked to have been, and therefore it may not work, and you have to be aware of that as a disadvantage. Okay, so it'd be a good idea to remember these advantages and disadvantages just in case you get this evaluate question. So pause the video here and have a go at answering some of these questions, or all of these questions here, and we'll go through the answers together once you've finished. Okay, so question 1, hopefully nice easy start. What is a stem cell? Well, very simply, it's an unspecialised cell. Okay, you can write just an unspecialised cell. If you've gone on to tell me what that means it's a cell that does not have a particular function. That is great, but really it's just an unspecialised cell. What are embryonic stem cells? Well, these are stem cells found in an embryo. So remember, it's a developing fetus before the 8-week mark, and they can differentiate into any, and the big thing here is any type of cell. Any type of cell. Give an example of a source of embryonic stem cells. Well, the obvious one is the embryo. So what are adult stem cells? Well, these are a type of stem cell that you can write as can only differentiate into certain types of cells. So it can only differentiate into certain types of cell. And you can also go on to write that potentially, although this is, I think, the next question it is, so we won't write it here. So we'll move on to question 5. Give an example of a source of an adult stem cell. Well, it's bone marrow. And finally, state 3 disadvantages of using embryonic stem cells. You also have to remember the advantages, of course, but let's just very quickly go over the disadvantages. Okay, so 1 is that idea you could be damaging or even killing the embryo. Okay, so taking away its potential life. Number 2 is that no consent can be given. Okay, and number 3, it's potentially unreliable and may not work. Okay, so they're the 3 disadvantages that I just taught you, so hopefully they're the 3 disadvantages that you wrote about. So we have now looked at stem cells, and what they are, the 2 different types, and then the advantages and the disadvantages of using embryonic stem cells in medicine. So again, lots to remember. You can now move on and work through the quiz on this topic, and you can also go through the exam questions. Again, just like with all topics, if you are unsure completely on what you're doing, if you didn't understand any particular point, you can get in contact with one of our tutors if you are a paying member, or if you're a non-paying member, then you can get into contact with the community through the activity feed, and I'm sure someone will help you out.